Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about neural plasticity, and that's the brain's ability to change itself. So you might be wondering why we're interested in studying the brain and why after years and years of movement practitioners looking at the body, why the brain is even interesting. Most of that is down to our current knowledge on what changes are possible to be made in the brain. Okay, so think about it when you do any kind of personal training certificate, which bit is it that you learn the most of? For most people, you're learning more about muscles at any time than you are about anything else. And why is it that you're learning about the muscles and not about the bones, for example? That's because the muscles have a bigger adaptability and a bigger ability to change based on the stimulus that's thrown at them. So you can learn about different types of muscle firing patterns, different muscles, agonists, antagonists. You can learn about, building muscle that kind of wastes away, and all different things that can happen to the muscles, whereas something like the bones don't really change very much. They do change. Change is definitely possible, but they don't change in the same way that the muscles do, and therefore the muscles are the more interesting thing to learn about. And similarly, when it comes to the brain, we used to think that the brain was just this organ that sits there, does what it does, but it doesn't actually change very much. You can do all this stuff to your body and that's going to change your body, but the brain was just going to react to that by running and functioning in the same way as it always did. And turns out that the more research we do into it, that is completely not the case. And I think that's really exciting. So today we'll be talking about how some of those changes are possible. So first little bit that we need to get into, let's just get a quick introduction to the brain. When we're thinking about what kinds of changes are possible, well, let's see how it's set up. The brain consists of 100 billion neurons. So think of neurons as like the brain cells that do stuff. So if I want to lift my arm up, let's say there's 1,000 different neurons that all need to fire and light up at the same time in a specific combination to let me move my arm. 100 billion of them, so that's a pretty large number to begin with. The more astounding number, though, is between these 100 billion neurons, there are 100 trillion brain cells connecting those neurons, okay? If you're not sure about the difference between a billion and a trillion, if you imagine it in terms of time, so 1,000,000 seconds is going to be about 12 days. 1,000,000,000 seconds is about 31 and a half or 3/4 years, something like that. So huge jump between 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000, but both within our lifetimes. I looked out, I actually celebrated my 1 billion second birthday because I'm a massive nerd, and it was super fun. But I've experienced both 1,000,000 seconds being 1,000,000 seconds old and 1 billion seconds old. 1,000,000,000,000 seconds old would be about 31,000 years, okay? So the jump between the billion and a trillion compared to the jump between 1,000,000 and 1 billion is incomprehensible. Nobody's ever going to live that long. Nobody's ever going to be able to imagine that. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the different ways that you can connect up all of these neurons and brain cells together is unfathomable. So even though we have a finite number, we can safely say that the potential of the human brain is infinite as far as anything that we can comprehend, okay? And the other interesting thing is throughout our lifetime, the brain is constantly reorganizing and shaping these connections. So the connections don't stay exactly the same throughout our life. We are going to lose some, we're going to move some. They're always going to be changing based on what is going on in our environment around us, okay? So at the beginning of our life, we have the most neural connections that we're ever going to have. And you might think that that's a really good thing, like the more connections, the better, but actually not so much. That saps up a lot of energy because every time the brain wants to fire a certain number of neurons in a certain order, it has to decide which pathway it's going to take at every single thing. So imagine like a junction. and it has to decide which way it's going to go every single time. That's going to, one, be very, very slow, and two, it's going to take a long time. So what the brain then wants to do is, as we progress through life and we start doing certain things more than other things, and we start doing other things less than other things, the brain's going to start to reorganize and reshuffle. So it's going to kill off any connections that we don't use. It's going to attach these like sheaths of fat around other connections that make them move way quicker, so that they become quicker and more energy efficient. So just as a little visual, imagine you're driving up to this junction, you just got a load of traffic lights, but no road signs anywhere, okay? So the more different options you have to turn, if you don't know where you're going, you don't have a sat nav, you don't have a map, you just know that you need to be going north somewhere, well, you could be turning right here, you could be turning left, you could go straight ahead. There's a couple of different lanes that you could be merging into. If you have to make that decision, it's going to take a lot longer, and there's no guarantee you're going the most efficient or the best way. So what will happen over time is the brain's going to start saying, all right, nobody's taking that right turn over there, so we're just going to close off that road. And this seems to be the quickest way to get to New York, so I'm going to put some road signs all the way down there. So the quickest way to lift my arm right up over my head, I'm going to make sure that that's clearly mapped out in the brain and in the body, so that I can do it in a more energy efficient way. So next thing that we need to understand about the brain is what it is for. So nobody designed the brain. It wasn't produced for any specific purpose, but based on what we see in nature and what we see everything that has a brain doing than everything that doesn't have a brain doing, we can kind of say what we think the brain is for. And it turns out, somewhat surprisingly for some of you maybe, that the primary output of the brain is movement. The reason we have brains is to facilitate movement, and actually not for anything else. That is the sole purpose, really, of the brain. So all of the neural pathways, everything that we've got, is in some way designed to help us move. We'll go into a bit more detail in a second. So in order to facilitate that, so we say the brain is for movement, but there's loads of different bits involved. So number one, we need to know what kind of world we're moving around in. So we're going to be taking in as much sensory information as possible in order to figure out, well, what does the world look like? I'm going to use my eyes, the five senses that we know about, like sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. All of that is going to feed into our brains to tell us what we think the world around us looks like. We're also going to take some information from the body, because we want to know how we are currently able to move. So things like our body temperature, our blood pressure, the acidity levels of our cells, and anything that we can get from the inside of our body is going to be fed up to the brain as well, because that's going to let us know, if our blood pressure is really high, we don't want to move too fast, because the pump's just going to get higher and higher pressure, and that could damage us. So all of that information needs to be known as well. Then we're going to have another portion of brain cells that are going to be involved in interpreting that information. So we've got the information of what the world looks like. Well, now we need to know what that means. What happens when the world is like this? What happens when our body is like this? And what are we going to do about it? So these kind of interpretation cells are the ones that, might go layers and layers deep, where we start thinking about things. So it could be very, very quick. You just go, okay, body temperature is like this. We can let it rise a good bit higher. So fine, run as fast as you can. Or it could be, that thing over there looks a little bit like a tiger. What other signs can I be looking for to confirm that it is or isn't a tiger? And, so there could be layers of, rumination and complex thinking involved in this decision-making bit. And then finally, once we've decided what all of this stuff means, then we need to make a decision of what kind of movements we want to do next. So do we need to run away? Do we need to fight? Are we relatively safe so we can go about, learning new things, or just resting and digesting food? that needs to be decided based on the information that we've got. So all of that lumps together and informs on our movement. So the cool thing about this is any area of the brain that we might want to influence, if the brain is built for movement, or it exists for the purpose of enabling movement, then even if the things that we're trying to improve don't seem like they're movement related, well, turns out they actually are. So stuff like we might want to improve our focus or our social relationships, or, you know, reduce anxiety or pain or anything like that. Even if it doesn't feel like it's involved with movement, it is in some way involved with movement, and therefore the better the understanding that we have of our brain, the more focused, the more targeted we can be in reaching those types of things. So, you know, if you want to be more organized and not show up late for things, there's going to be an element of, you know, thinking and strategic thinking that you're going to need to do. But there's probably also movements that can influence the areas of the brain that are involved in that as well. So the more that we know, the more we can influence, and we can influence it in a targeted way. This is one of the reasons, by the way, a lot of mental health conditions recommend exercise as one of the things that you can do in order to see a positive improvement in symptoms. The exercise is just movement. It's movement of some kind, and the reason they keep it really vague is if you don't know how to target it, well, if you just do as much, you know, if you mix up as much as you possibly can, then there's a good chance that you're going to hit the right one eventually. Okay, wanted to add this little picture in as well, because when it comes to movement and when it comes to sports, we usually don't really think of using the brain as the more athletic endeavor. So we've got Usain Bolt here and Magnus Carlsen, the best chess player currently in the world. And if I asked you, you know, hey, I work with brains, which one of these do you think that I would be working with? Everybody automatically just jumps to, well, it's obviously going to be the chess player because brains are for thinking, and you know, that's harder to do. And I just wanted to explain a little bit of why it might be the case that we associate brains with doing stuff that doesn't seem like movement if the brains are built for movement. And the reason it's kind of just sort of flips it right on its head. The reason we don't associate Usain Bolt's running with using the brain as much is, even though he is using his nervous system as much as Magnus Carlsen is, he's using it in the way that it's most efficiently designed to be used. He's using it in order to just sprint fast as he can from A to B. That is the purpose of your brain and nervous system, is to get you moving. And it does that by, you know, regulating and coordinating all of your bodily functions to enable that to happen. So when you're using it the way that it's supposed to be used, people think that it's not being used just because it's all working and happening efficiently. Magnus Carlsen, on the other hand, if you imagine when people play chess, you have to think several moves ahead. And what he needs to do to enable that to happen is he needs to imagine the movements of the pieces. So he's actually doing movement, but in this like weird meta way where he's making imaginary movements happen, and then based on that he's got another layer of imaginary movements that are happening, plus all of the the sensory information gathered, the decision making and the or the interpretation and the decision making movement output. All of that's happening all at the same time, but on like 2 to 3 layers up. So he's trying to get his brain to do the processes that would be required for physical movement without actually physically moving. And that's why it's considered to be the more brainy discipline, just because you have to work harder to force it to do things in a way that it's not set up to do efficiently. Okay, so now we get into the idea of changing the brain. So I said the name of this lesson was neuroplasticity, and so neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to form and reorganize synaptic connections, especially in response to learning or experience or following injury. Basically, that's just saying is anytime the world around us changes, the brain usually decides it's going to change as well. Okay, whenever we experience new things, the brain is going to start reorganizing itself in a way that helps it better deal with the new stimulus that has appeared to us. So the brain is going to remain plastic throughout our lifetimes. That's really important, and that is the reason why the kind of neuro stuff is taking off right now. Is for a very long time we were sure that at age 25 the brain stopped changing. It was not possible to learn any new things, which you would have thought people would have just realized wasn't true when they went out in the real world and looked and discovered it. But unfortunately, that's not how science works. And yeah, this was considered like a common assumption that, you know, whatever it was that you were learning, your brain wasn't learning it. Your brain already had all the information it could possibly have, and it was never going to change. Now we know that that's not true. Throughout our entire life, our brain is able to continually reorganize and, you know, cut away and rebuild these connections between the neurons, and that helps us to change, whether it's our behaviors, our personalities, or movement ability, anything like that. So, final thing we need to look at is what influences neuroplasticity. We got 4 different things. So number 1, growth, age, or development. That's going to be good news for the younger of you and bad news for everybody else. Depending on what age you are, you're more receptive. Your brain is more receptive to change. We know that for sure. That doesn't negate what I just said. We still know that it's possible up to any age of our life. It's just there are certain ages where we're more receptive to changing things than other times. For the rest of us that have already passed that age of 25, we've also got fuel availability, exercise intensity, and attention and focus. So we'll just deep dive into what each of these means. So the age and development, as I said, at certain ages, we're more receptive. Pretty much our entire childhood, we are more receptive to change, but depending on what age we're at, the specific thing the brain is interested in is going to change with it. Okay, so as an example, between up to age 7, the sensory stuff, you know, stuff like sight, sound, smells, touch, those kinds of things, our brain is going to be super interested in everything because it's never experienced any of them before. So it's trying to figure out, well, which ones of these are different from each other, and which ones do I experience most, which ones do I experience least, which ones are good, which ones are bad. So those areas of the brain are going to reorganize themselves very, very quickly depending on what information comes in. As a teenager, you're going to be less interested in the sensory stuff and more interested in what's going on around you. So you'll be interested in your sense of self, who you are as a person, what kind of identity you have, and how that identity fits in with everybody else. And this is one of the reasons why schooling doesn't work for so many teenagers, is you get told to sit down and shut up and listen to a teacher who's trying to give you a ton of information that your brain doesn't care about. Your brain cares about the bits that are important to you and all of the other people in the room. It's not interested in the kind of more banal stuff that doesn't influence your social standing. So a lot of people's brains just check out because they're not interested in learning that. So while I say as a child, you've got loads of your brain is more receptive to change, it doesn't necessarily mean it's more receptive to everything. What it is receptive to will change over time as well. So depending on which one it's interested in, it's going to reorganize itself more easily, and over time that will switch to becoming different things as well. And we're thought to have ended this entire process by age 25, which means we are still receptive to change, but our brain doesn't actively seek it out in the same way as it did up until that point. Okay, so then next one, fuel. In order to survive, the brain requires glucose and oxygen. Everything else involved in nutrition is, going to maintain things and, help with recovery and things like that. But if you want the brain to actually be working in the moment, it needs glucose, so sugar, and it needs oxygen. And those two things kind of just explode and react with each other, and that causes the energy that the brain uses, okay? Now, your brain is constantly interested in survival. So if you have low fuel, or if the brain doesn't know how much fuel that you have, then it's going to say it is not worth taking the risk to engage in this kind of plasticity and this reorganizing and relearning and being open to new stimulus and new experiences. It's going to just say, look, the habits that you've got are very fuel efficient, so just use those, okay? And it's important to know it's if the supplies are either low or the supplies are unknown. That's interesting when it comes to something like oxygen, because if your breathing is poor, then the brain cannot count on you having sufficient oxygen supplies, even though you're in an oxygen-rich environment. So if you have any issues in your breathing, which we'll look at in the next module, then you'll actually find that the brain is less receptive to learning new things because it doesn't think it's going to have enough fuel for engaging in that. And same thing with glucose. So, if you've just started intermittent fasting or something like a ketogenic diet where it becomes harder for the brain to make glucose, and at the same time you've also just decided you're going to start learning some new skills, you probably find your learning curve is going to be much slower and it's not going to be that beneficial for you. Whereas if you've just eaten and you've had some carbs or something that provides you with the glucose more easily, and then you go to try learn new things, that's going to be a lot easier because the brain is confident that it has enough fuel to go on. So the brain doesn't allow new learning to occur unless it's got sufficient supply of both. Next module is going to be on fuel, so we'll kind of cover exactly what that means. Next up then, we've got intensity. So again, because we're interested in conserving energy to survive, if we just go around wasting all of our fuel supply and then something dangerous happens, that's not very good. So the brain then needs to decide, how important is this new stimulus to me? So anything that isn't stimulating the brain very much or to a high enough degree, it's just going to say, well, maybe you're interested in learning this, but it's not worth me reorganizing all of these brain cells and reorganizing these structures because that thing doesn't really pose any kind of a threat to me. So the higher the intensity of a stimulus, the stronger the change that's going to happen in the brain. And that's true no matter how intense you go. The more intense it is, the bigger the change that's going to happen in your brain. Now, we will talk later on about how this doesn't have to be a positive change necessarily, okay? So when you have something that is too intense, your brain's still going to change. It's just not necessarily going to change and adapt in the way that you want it to, where you learn to tolerate or overcome this kind of stimulus. It might start reorganizing in a way that promotes escape, and those kind of changes aren't necessarily good for you, but if the intensity is high enough, the brain is going to change absolutely. So what we want to basically figure out is, how can we give a level of intensity that is just high enough that the brain wants to learn about it and learn to deal with the problem rather than to run away from the problem. The two best or most common ways of increasing the intensity are going to be increase the load, increase the time. If you've done any kind of strength training, this shouldn't be any big shock to you. You either do more reps, so you're learning a new skill. Do you do it little and often, or do you have one really in-depth focused session that could be really heavy weights, or it could just be very deliberate practice. So finding your weakest area and, spending a good 10 minutes focusing on the very weakest things that you have to think really hard about. Both are good examples of increasing the load. Finally, we've got focus. So every single second of our lives, there's tons of things that our brain's picking up on. So, you might be able to feel how your feet feel on the floor right now, but your brain is picking up every single bit. So your trouser legs, all of the sensation that is touching every bit of skin, your brain's picking that up. All of the light that you're not paying attention to, the brain's picking that up. All of the sounds that have just happened, the brain's picking up. At every second of every day, all of this information's coming in, and the brain basically has to decide, well, how much of this is even important? And one of the biggest weights that the brain can place on importance is what we are actually paying attention to. Okay, so you might have a noise that's so loud that your brain just says, this is dangerous, you've got to act, and so somebody makes that big loud noise behind you and you just jump. You didn't have any say in that because the intensity that we just talked about was so big that the brain said, I don't care what you think, this is important. But most of the time, we don't have things that are so threatening that the brain is automatically acting, and what we do have is just loads of things that potentially could be important. If we place our conscious focus on the thing that we're trying to learn, we're more likely to improve in it. Okay, so this is the big kind of no-no that you see when you go to the gym and you see somebody on the exercise bike and they've got a phone or a tablet or even a book, and they're just pedaling away but reading the book, thinking that's going to be the best thing for their fitness because they're going to be able to go for longer. And maybe it is true, maybe they just wouldn't be able to motivate themselves to go there if they didn't bring the book, so actually it's better than nothing. But if they really wanted to be improving their endurance, let's say, then you want to be focusing on the sensation of enduring the exercise. So, have it high intensity and then focus on which bits of you are feeling tired right now and just focusing on pushing them a little bit harder. Or maybe it was your breathing that you want to do. You want to improve your VO2 max or something. So you would focus on how you're breathing, focus on the sensation of your lungs. If you place your focus there, the brain realizes that is the important bit and it's going to improve the learning. So this is obvious to some people, not obvious to other people, but very much so. We'll try and talk about it throughout the course. If you're putting your focus there, it's more likely that you're actually going to learn the thing and that your brain's actually going to change. Okay. So final little point there, our focus is linked up with all the other sensory information. So, just because you're focusing on it, like I said, with the loud noise, doesn't mean your brain's always going to act positively towards it, but it's a strongly favorable weight that the thing that you're focusing on, the brain is going to place more weight on reorganizing those specific neurons, those specific brain cells.